Greetings, action designers. Zach Simon here with a quick producer's note before we get into this latest episode. This is just a disclaimer that this episode was recorded earlier in 2020, before COVID 19, commonly known as the coronavirus, escalated into the global pandemic that it is today. That is the reason you will not hear it covered at all in the content of this episode. All of us on the Action Design Radio podcast team certainly send our very best wishes to our listeners, members, and everyone in the Action Design Network community at large. This coronavirus outbreak is truly a wild and unprecedented time in our modern history where people are suffering physically, financially, and mentally. As the situation continues to develop, please be safe, be smart, and take care. We also urge you to find a way to take this unfortunate situation and turn it into an opportunity. In the spirit of this episode's topic on behavior and spirituality, perhaps we can take all of this extra time spent at home and use some of it for introspection and reflection. It may be a healthy idea to unglue ourselves from the news or social media for a few minutes to spend on betterment and self-care, whether that takes the form of meditation, prayer, or heightened mindfulness. Because that is the topic of today's podcast, how we can design our environment to support meditation and prayer and break free for a moment from stress and distractions. When life gives you lemons, right? Once again, take care and enjoy this latest episode. Thank you. You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
Hello and welcome to Action Design Radio. I'm your host, Zarak. With me, as always, Erik Johnson.
Hello, everyone.
And we have a special treat for everyone today. Someone who, our guest is someone who you've heard their name every episode when we thank them at the end. But this is the first time that we are having him on, Steve Wendel. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me. It was a real pleasure.
So Steve is
I think this is a long time in the making. I think we've talked about having you on since the inception of this podcast, but just finally working out. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I think we've always kind of felt like, oh, like we've got Steve in our back pocket for, if we ever like really are like, oh man, we can't get any, we're totally out of ideas.
I will say that's not as much because you're a second order guest, but because we know you pretty well. So
I have no problem being a backup plan.
Well, it's sort of like, when the person's the founder of the nonprofit or the organization, it's like you kind of know that you can call them in if you need to.
No, it's been a great podcast, and it's really been wonderful watching you guys grow this and really talk to so many great people in the field. I hope I can contribute a little bit here.
Well, that's the thing. We wanted to make you like work for it a little bit too.
Okay.
It's like you can't just be handed to you on the silver platter.
No. We'll see if this can meet your standard or not. I'm hoping, man. I'm hoping. You've had so many solid people that we're gonna have to do something completely different in order to like do something new here.
Well, and as a matter of fact, I think that we do have something completely different here. So, in addition to being the head of behavioral science at Morningstar, and you wrote a book last year called Spiritual Design, and it was I remember like talking with you about this when I guess like a little bit maybe before it came out or right as it was coming out, and I was like, man, this like sounds like such an interesting topic and like unique kind of combination of ideas, and I'm excited that we finally get a chance to kind of dig into it and talk about it, because it's really not something that I've heard anyone talk about, but as I read the book, I was like, man, this makes a lot of sense. So before we dive into that, maybe for those listeners who only know you as the founder of Action Design, if you want to just kind of tell folks sort of who you are, sort of your journey in life, behavioral science, and then I think that kind of leads into sort of a discussion of the book and like why you decided to write this book.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Rock. So Yeah, I guess I started, right now I'm the head of behavioral science at Morningstar, and we have a nice team of folks doing both behavioral consulting, doing some product work, original research, et cetera. And it's just a wonderful group of people. Before that, I actually started in the field at a company called Hello Wallet. So unlike many people who enter in, I was trying to do something and failing horribly. In this case, I was trying to, working at this startup that was personal financial management, helping people budget, save for the future, et cetera. And we were telling people, you need to save. And we, as we started talking to our users, they said, yeah, no shit. We know that. Like, why are you saying it? People already know to save, right? They already know what they need to do. And, well, we weren't moving the needle, right? We weren't helping people do anything different. And so what we did is we started to turn to the behavioral literature. I was doing a PhD part-time while I was working at Hello Wallet, and I had just the complete luck of having of studying under one of the early experimentalists in my field. And we started to say, okay, how can we actually help people close this gap between what they want to do and what they're actually doing? And from there, I really just got to learn from many wonderful people. Actually set up Action Design in order to learn from the really cool folks out there, because I knew nothing. And it was just an opportunity to connect with and draw from this great community of people.
And so you've been in the field now for 10 years, something like
Decades.
This. I mean, like, right? It's like old man Steve.
That's right.
One of the OGs of behavioral science.
I definitely do kind of think of you as one of the OGs. Yeah, literally teaching a class on behavioral science this semester, and your book, Designing for Behavior Change, is one of the ones that we are talking about, one of the models that we look at. And so, I know.
Okay, so how many people ask, is he still alive?
I thought he was a one-hit wonder.
A one-hit Wendel?
Wendel, yeah.
Yeah. So you've been doing this for a really long time. I mean, kind of one of the sort of founders of the field.
No, just to be clear, certainly not a founder of the field.
Okay. Well, I mean,
one of the early folks in private companies.
Yeah, in an applied setting, like growing. Okay, yeah, I guess if we're talking about like an academic field, maybe not, but like I think growing sort of like the practice for sure, right? I mean, like just doing action design, and I'm not trying to sort of like. A
few others. We started about 10 years ago. I mean, folks like Paul Slovic, he's doing this in the 70s.
Yeah.
Right. So there's some from the decision sciences, but yeah, in terms of like the modern wave after Nudge and after particularly Rational and such. Yeah, we were some of the first folks in a corporate or nonprofit environment.
And you'd written, and the book that I was just referencing was Designing for Behavior Change. So you had written that in like 2006 maybe, or 2010, something like that.
Oh, not that far. Started in 2011, finished in 12, and published in 13.
Okay. So I guess that was right around when I met you, actually.
And I should quickly tell everyone so the new edition of the book is coming out, and if you're looking for that, you were in the wrong place.
Yeah, you're in the wrong place.
It's going to be a very different conversation today.
Yeah, so you will be in the right place at some point. We'll probably do a podcast about that book as well when it comes out.
We may or may not have another podcast soon once the new version comes out.
There you
go. Listeners will have to wait and see.
Well, so I'm interested in, you had already written a book that was sort of more kind of a practitioner's guide to behavioral science or applying behavioral science. And then how long were you thinking about writing this book, Spiritual Design, and what was sort of the genesis of it? It sounds like you were noticing maybe parallels between the financial work of sort of like, oh, people are expressing these goals or desires and not meeting them, or kind of like, like quote unquote, like falling short, and maybe seeing parallels in sort of like a spiritual life. So when did you first start thinking about that or making that connection?
And give us a quick introduction and definition of what you mean by spiritual design in and of itself, and kind of how listeners should think about that as a topic.
Yeah, sure. So I think spiritual design is that we can apply lessons from behavioral science to have a more meaningful spiritual life in two ways. So we can shape our environment, our physical environment, our social environment, our mental environment, so that we act in a way that expresses our faith, right? For Buddhists, that might be a compassion. For a Christian, it might be charitable works, expressing gratitude for grace, etc. And then second, I think we can design our environment to help us spend a little bit more time and to focus our minds more on God and spiritual pursuits. So both the kind of what we'd call a spiritual formation and a spiritual practice. And it's applying lessons from behavioral science to do both.
What are some of like the kind of practical examples of what this looks like? So if somebody's trying to put this into practice, what are some examples for them to get started?
Yeah, sure. So let's give this a pretty common example. Let's say you want to meditate more, you want to pray more, right? What do? Well, for a lot of people, they might say, okay, well, oh man, I'm so busy. I don't know when I can do this. Maybe I try and find some time here, try and find some time there. But, well, no, behavioral science gives us some great tools to think about that process, okay? One is, do you have a specific place? So I set aside a specific place in the house. I have a particular mat that I like to sit on while I pray, right? It's beautiful, by the way. You should see it. I set a particular time, right? So I have a calendar item that says, okay, this is the time. I intentionally remove distractions from that space. I set a social commitment with my family, right? And now with all of you. I didn't think of it that way. I set a social commitment that I do this every day. And so I'm creating my physical environment to remove distractions, right? I'm setting up my social environment, right? And I'm setting up these cues, right? The calendar, etc. Those are all lessons from behavioral science. Other things would be like temptation bundling, where you know that there's something that in the long term you want to do, like, hey, for some people, man, you had a horrible church experience as a kid, but you want to try it, right? Maybe you want to go back. You want to like try a different community. So, okay, but you're not really sure about it. So you bundle together, okay, I am going to go try this community of faith, and then I'm going to go see this really crappy movie that I couldn't excuse myself for seeing otherwise, but man, I want to go see. That would be a temptation bundling, right?
Those are great examples. Yeah, thanks.
And have the community be by the movie theater where the crappy movie is playing.
Yes. Right. So I've been a Quaker all my life. Well, not all my life, sorry. Since high school, when I met a Quaker girl, and well, the rest is history. So, but I've been a Quaker for a very long time, and it's an amazing community, but it's not one that really talks about, at least the tradition I come from, doesn't talk about spirituality very much. And so, ironically, it was behavioral science that helped me think more about what I was doing already, and what it meant, and really what was lacking in my own life. And so it was about, say 5 years ago, I started to read a lot more myself, read some contemplative authors, read from folks in the field, and said, wow, this is interesting, right? This is something that hasn't been part of my life, but I see some value there. And over the next few years, I started applying behavioral science, not to make myself believe anything, right? But rather to just kind of remove some of the baggage that I had, the baggage about not thinking about it, thinking that it's a strange thing, etc., and just try to have an open mind. And from that, I said, wow, wait a minute, I'm applying behavioral science to spirituality. That's interesting. Started looking around to see if there's anyone else writing about this. And about 3 years ago, I started writing the book, primarily for myself, right, to explore how I could help myself just be a little more open. And again, not with any particular goal in mind, but just be a little more open.
Yeah, it's interesting. That was one of the first things that I was thinking as I started the book. I was like, who's this book for? You know, and I mean, it does make sense to say like you wrote it for yourself almost, because I was like, wow, it seems like it's in some ways it's written almost like kind of universally. Like you take great care, I think, to sort of, you're obviously not sort of like prescribing any like one sort of like religion or religious tradition or anything like that. You're sort of talking about kind of spiritual development in general, to the extent that any person wants to do that, to pursue that for themselves. But it feels very personal at the same time. So it does sort of feel like, oh, like it almost feels like kind of like Steve's diary. But then it was like you went back through and were like, now how would I take this and make it broadly applicable to a bunch of different sort of religions or kind of spiritual practices?
Yeah, and that's really how it came about. And it may be helpful also for listeners if I define what spiritual design is as well, and then give that a little context to the book. So I think of spiritual design as the ability to shape our environment to make it easier for us, more likely for us to both live faith when we have it, and to explore or be open to faith when we want that, right? It is not a statement about what you should believe. It's not a statement about really what you should do, but rather that we have intention action gaps in both how we live out our life, right? How we express the things we believe, spiritual actions, as well as spiritual focus. Just for most of us, it is so bloody difficult just to spend time thinking about greater meaning, right? Thinking about these things. And so the book it's my trying to open myself up in those ways, right? I was writing out what I wanted to try, what I wanted to do, and then you're right? I went back and said, okay, how can I make this less about me, right? Because it was for myself, and I just enjoy writing, but hopefully something that's useful more broadly, right? Now look, I'm a Quaker, and there just ain't that many of us out there. So and we have a very particular tradition. So I'm pretty sure that I'm going to make everybody angry who comes from any spiritual tradition. So I just kind of take that as given, and I tried to instead say, look, I'm not pushing anything, right? I don't have any agenda for what other people believe, but personally, I found it valuable to try and spend some time with this stuff and see what it means for our lives, and hopefully these techniques can help other people.
Yeah, and I think it's worth building on that point of like, all right, what exactly do you mean, or we mean by like spirituality here? And I think, to your point in writing the book, you have to go through your own personal example and your beliefs to really illustrate the process. But it's worth drawing out that like spirituality can mean really anything to anyone. Like maybe off the top of your head, like the obvious connotation is with a specific religion. But when I was kind of reading through the book and I was thinking about it, to me, it's really anything that you use or even are trying to find that brings you like meaning and fulfillment. And that could be just a simple meditation practice to pause, reset yourself. Could be philosophy that you're into that helps you sort of navigate life. So I think it's worth like drawing that out, and that whatever it is that helps you find additional meaning, additional fulfillment in your life beyond the typical day-to-day stuff that we have is is a spiritual practice, and that doesn't have to be a formal religion that you're a part of. It's really anything like that. And the other part of that I think is worth drawing out too is like you mentioned, building the room to actually explore that. Because I think a lot of people, we're really busy in our lives, and we sort of go through all these steps, and we sort of lose sight of like what we really believe in any sort of format, or what are the broader meanings that we're looking to get out of life. So I think those are kind of two key distinctions to like draw out when we talk about spiritual design, and that it's really brought everybody has some sort of need for this kind of thing, or they're doing some kind of practice. It just can be a non-traditional way of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think many people feel a hunger, right? A sense that there is more than the things we buy and the people we talk to, right? And to answer that hunger, people take many different paths, right? And I'm not one to judge which path that people take, right? I believe in God, right? And I follow the path of Jesus from the Bible. Lots of other people don't. And if you find that you can understand your place in the world, why we're here and what we're doing, and it helps you find, in my terminology, find God's peace, then awesome, right? I want to help if I can, right? Not because I have any special knowledge, right? But because I think, hey, I've tried some things, other people have tried some things. How do we get to that place, right? And what's ironic is that the vast majority of Americans, right, since we're speaking in the U.S., actually believe in God. We just never talk about this stuff. And I mean, there are large groups that follow in a particular way, but we still just don't talk about that. And so it becomes uncomfortable. We have to dodge around it sometimes. And I think it gives the impression that it's strange or unusual, but when you dig in and talk to folks, so many people are looking to either they have a faith and they're trying to follow it and they're just very quiet about it, or they're trying to understand what faith means. And I think, cool, good good for them. And let's, how can we create that space in our society as well as in ourselves to allow that, to allow an honest and thoughtful search.
Yeah, sorry, let me just build on that a little. And just that point too. And we're talking the topic of spiritual design is something that, I haven't seen discussed anywhere. And this is definitely a new topic. But the topic of, people's beliefs and religion in society is something that's pretty well studied in the social science. And we're sort of at an interesting point in culture where traditional religious affiliation has been dropping for a while. And that's a personal opinion, whether you think that's good or bad or not. But regardless of what people call it, everybody needs some sort of kind of meaning. They need community. And there is a lot of interesting research now of how people are starting to fill those gaps. And I think a lot of it's what's interesting, and an interesting direction to think about spiritual design is like a lot of people might be filling that gap. So like maybe people grew up in a traditionally religious household, didn't really find it worked for them, and they wouldn't consider themselves religious now. But there probably is something that they're doing to find meaning, to find community, and they might not even be aware of it. So there's, a big shift happening in our culture. And I think it's sort of an important discussion to have. There's part of it, which is, okay, I have a spiritual practice and I'm just trying to do it better, but also just finding what that is for me, because I'm probably doing something I'm not even aware of it. And maybe I don't feel particularly fulfilled by that. How can I find something that does that, regardless of whether that's a religion, that's a philosophy, it's just a community or whatever that is?
No, I agree. I mean, there's been a large body of research in sociology of religion, et cetera, psychology of religion. Most of it is explicitly hostile, right? They're folks who, you get the impression they're folks who grew up in a strong religious tradition and were burned, right? And they say, no, none of this is right. Let's uncover the deep biases or problems of people that they use because, that causes them to go to religion. And I think now we're starting to, I hope, get a little more balance and say, look, people search, some people find, right? Why is that? What different forms is that taking? What are the modern forms of finding meaning, understanding our place in the world, understanding why we're here? And you're right. I mean, there's some really cool discussions going on about how different communities start to play that role. They provide a sense of meaning. They provide a sense of common search and common effort that doesn't necessarily take a traditional religious form. And I think, cool, right? Now I am part of a traditional religious background, and I say, great, right? Great because as you said, we can be distracted for a long time, but there are times in our lives and we're like, what else is there? What else is there? And the plurality of forms of ways to answer that, I think, is wonderful.
So let's maybe dive a little bit into the sort of practices that you talk about in the book, or the applications of behavioral science. Like, so let's say that, it's either you can use yourself as an example, or just say that they want to try applying behavioral science to their own sort of spiritual practice or spiritual life. What are some of like the tips or the things that you've found either most helpful, or where should people start?
Yeah, sure. So I think of it as there's an understanding of the mind, and then there's a set of techniques, right? I think understanding mind is perhaps the more foundational and more important. Is a lot of folks, myself very much included, look at our lives and say, well, I'm not, this is in the past, I'm not going to church regularly, I don't talk about this, I'm not reading the Bible. Maybe it's just not that important to me at this part of my life. Maybe when I'm older, I will, right? Maybe when I'm in my 60s, right? I'll come back to religion. I got other things to do right now. And I think one of the key lessons of behavioral science is maybe that's true, or maybe there's just a gap between the variety of things that you want to do in your life and what you do. And that maybe there are other things getting in the way. And we shouldn't, as it were, self-signal. We shouldn't take our own lack of action as a signal that this isn't one of the things that's important to us. And so that's why I think of it as, first and foremost, removing the baggage, removing all this tremendous weight that is, oh, no, okay, if I start thinking about this stuff, I must be a zealot, if I start, et cetera, right? Or, well, I had to do all this so much as a kid, and now I'm free, right? And I think first and foremost is, how can we just take it a little easy on ourselves? How can we allow ourselves to look and see what's important to us? And that also when we are trying, right, that don't beat yourself up. If you're not, so I think of it as both action from faith and faithful focus, right? If, for example, your faith tradition says, look, you should be giving to charity, right? You should be caring for the neediest, like mine does. We're all gonna fall short of that. All of us are imperfect people. And I think a key lesson of behavioral science is, yep, that's true. And there are other ways of trying to do better than simply beating yourself up, right? That we can change our environment to help us express our faith, to do what we want to do, in addition to just saying, I should be a better person, I should be a better person, why am I doing this, why am I doing this, right? So that's kind of the philosophy part.
Yeah, I like that you make like a big point. I mean, there is sort of like a section in the book where it's sort of like highlighting like punishment really doesn't work that well,
Yeah.
right? Like, and I think that is a great point. I mean, I guess I hadn't really thought about it in this way before, but like in this conversation, like it's come up a number of times, the amount of, yeah, you use the word baggage, right? Like the amount of baggage that people might have that like before they're even getting started on this, like you have to kind of shed some of this or remove some of this before like building, I don't know, like a better, I don't know if like healthier is not necessarily the right word for it, but
like open
practice. Yeah. So having sort of set the kind of like philosophy or like this understanding of the mind, as I was reading the book, I was like, man, this is everything in here is so familiar to me.
Yeah.
Because like, I mean, it's funny, like as I was reading like the chapter headings, I was like, oh, I think I know exactly what he's going to say here, because like it just seemed to click with like, oh yeah. So I mean, like you have sort of a section where you're applying, frameworks or research that like we've talked about on this podcast a bunch.
yeah.
Anyone who's read behavioral science stuff is going to be very familiar with like, the research and stuff that you're citing, which is also kind of cool. Like, I mean, you're citing all these studies throughout the book, which is awesome. And so, there's like, 4 chapters that kind of lay out like the East framework and applying the East framework to spiritual practice. And like, as I was going through, because when we first talked about this book, I was like, oh, like that's interesting. Like I don't really know what to picture, And then as soon as I just read like the chapter list, I was like, oh, I think I know exactly what this book is saying, and like it made total sense to me. But for those who haven't necessarily put these things together in their mind, or I don't know, or haven't read the book, which if you're interested in this, obviously you should read the book. What are the ways in which people can apply these things? You see people applying this, or you apply this in your own sort of spiritual, in a spiritual design way. That's beyond just sort of like marketing or whatever, right?
Yeah, indeed. So I mean, you're right. One of my fears is that like for this audience, this is all going to be old hat. Right? It's like normal stuff. So, I mean, first and foremost, where's your attention? Our attention is drawn to so many things, to ads, right? To our kids, if we have them, right? To our jobs. What cues you to think about anything spiritual, right? Other than a televangelist on TV, and you turn that off, right? Which, not even going to get on Netflix anymore. Rather, so for me, I go pretty old school. I got the Bible on my bedside. And before that, right, so I studied Buddhism for a while, both Thich Nhat Hanh's Engaged Buddhism of Vietnam, as well as Zen Buddhism. I had Buddhist books, right, on the bedside, because that helped me think, okay, yeah, when I'm going to bed and I'm not quite ready to sleep, cool, I got something thoughtful that'll help me find some peace and pursue this path a little bit more. It's a cue that wouldn't otherwise be there. In our daily lives, at least in the cities I've been, right? In Chicago, in DC, in San Francisco, people don't talk about this stuff. And so you need something to cue your thoughts, right? Beyond that, right?
There's often not external cues, so you really have to deliberately build it yourself. Yeah,
exactly, right. So you have to create these cues, right? So for me, it's habits, right? It's, as Neer's talked about, both in his first book and kind of the reverse somewhat in the second book. So I make the point, even before I had any sincere faith, to be honest, right? I made the point to spend some time in contemplation before every meal. Pretty old school. I bow my head. I try to take a moment to connect or try to connect with God, right? And say, okay, I'm here, I'm listening, what's going on? And so so that's another technique, right? And I do that. There's a very strong habit I've formed around that. I know the exact time, right? It's whenever I do, whenever I'm sitting down to a meal.
If I can ask,
Yeah.
and feel free to decline to
Yeah,
answer this
please.
question because it's a somewhat personal question maybe, but
Yeah.
you just said before you had what was the term? What
Before I
was
had
like
faith.
before you had faith, you were already doing this sort
Yes.
of practice or habit. Why were you doing it at that point?
So it's a little complicated. Let me try and explain in the kind of Quaker story. So I come from an unprogrammed meeting tradition, which is people sit in silence for an hour, and usually an hour on Sundays. And then if someone feels moved to speak, they stand up and speak. But from my background, there's absolutely no training and no education about, okay, what are you listening for? What are you doing? So for 25 years of my life, right, I would sit in silence and think, okay, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? What am I doing here? And as I started to, read the Bible more, and as I started to learn more, I was like, oh, okay, I'm getting a sense of what the Quaker founders did, right? They knew the Bible by heart. I mean, they were serious folks. And some of that it hasn't transferred as well to the modern day. And so for me, I took that form and said, okay, I want to do something with this. I want to use this to explore. I want to try and spend time opening myself even before I had the religion, right? Not because I wanted to believe something, but rather I knew how difficult it is to remove the distractions of your life. And this was just one moment I could say, okay, let me just spend 30 seconds, right, for every meal, a minute and a half, right? It's not much to give. And it just tremendously helped me to set aside that time and say, yeah, okay, this is actually something I want to do more of. This is something I want to do more of.
I'll just throw like a example. Like as you're talking about that, I realized like I've had it's called a 5 minute journal. It's this little journal that is supposed to take 5 minutes a day, as the name
Yeah.
says.
Hey.
And this I hadn't even thought about it, but it's very similar to that sort of practice. And that like, all right, in the beginning of the day, you're supposed to write down 3 things you're grateful for, like right at the beginning of the day when you wake up, and plan your day out a little bit. And then at the end of the day, you're supposed to write down like 3 great things that happened during the day. And it's a really small thing that just like, all right, I wake up, all right, I might be getting distracted by my phone or whatever. Let's pause and think about like, all right, what are the good things that are going on right now? And especially at the end of the day when like you're probably stressed, a little burned out, whatever. It's like, oh, some cool things actually happened today. And
Yeah.
that's a spiritual practice in and of itself, and that you're
Yeah.
removing yourself from the noise of like the day to day and thinking a little bit beyond. And
Exactly.
it's a really small habit that makes a big difference in just my perspective, and just how I feel about everything in a given day. Because I could have like the worst day ever, and I'll still sit and think about 3 good things. I'm like, oh, like I had a great burrito today, and I was like, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And just little things like that. It's thinking like, what are those little habits you can build that take you out of the day to day stress and think a little bit into the bigger picture.
That's a great example, right? Because it allows you to like take that time, and it's also like turning your mind towards spiritual matters, and maybe other thoughts come up, right? And so that's what we call an opening. I think that's a great example. I think also having a community of people that it's okay to talk about this. For some people, that's church. For some people, it's a discussion group, right? It's a men's group, whatever it might be.
You can even say
But
like
that's
therapy or something like that. Like,
yeah.
yeah.
Like for me, I found that so we're part of a Lutheran church, which is absolutely wonderful. It is just an astoundingly great place. Thoughtful, deep people here in Oak Park in Illinois, and for me, that's also like it's a wonderful descriptive norm. It's like, yeah, there are other people thinking about and trying to live a faithful life. I just find that really reassuring. Not in the sense that they're telling me what to do or I'm telling them what to do. Just like, yeah, there are other people on this journey. So that's a social technique, right? And then I also look to, okay, how do you make things timely, right? Or how do you make things in the T in the East framework, right? Well, you set up a schedule, right? And part of that is the building of habits, but the schedule of, I have reminders on my calendar. I have a certain time of day, it says time for God. I know it seems cheesy, but it's like, look, I look at my calendar all the time. It's on my phone. I'm checking that thing going, what meeting? I'm like, oh yeah, I have this thing.
Meeting with the big guy.
What's that?
A meeting with the big guy.
Yeah, meeting with the big guy. Usually it's mostly me just listening and right, trying to be open. But so I try to apply each of those techniques. I do self-signaling as well. So I wear a cross every day. I don't do that. I don't show it to anybody else. Right? It's not even, to be frank, actually something I think I've talked about with anybody else before this. But I do. It's right here, right? And I feel it when I walk, and that reminds me, okay, this is part of me. It's incomplete. I want to develop more. I want to deepen in my faith, but it's part of me, and this is something important. When everything else is geared towards distraction, that's a little reminder.
So to build on this conversation on habits and these reminders, how do you keep these habits sort of meaningful, right? Because there are, I could see sort of like, checking your phone, and you get like your 5 minutes before like time with God or whatever, and you're like, I can't do it today or whatever. I mean, like it's great to have these prompts and to build these habits, but like in some cases, right, like you have the habit of brushing your teeth, like you want it to become like automatic so that you don't think about it anymore. But for some spiritual practice, like you kind of want that intention to be there. So how do you balance those things?
Yeah, habits. This is fascinating, right? What it can be. So, habits are the outsourcing of your behavior to the environment, right? And by definition, there can't be any spiritual content in that, because you're not doing it intentionally. And I find, so I was talking to a buddy of mine who's Catholic, right? And he talked about how he grew up with the Catholic liturgy, and it was tremendously frustrating, right? And he talked to lots of folks who grow up with a strong liturgy, and they're like, oh man, it just you're doing the same thing. It just becomes so empty over time, and that changes over time, I think, right? I think when people, some of the baggage comes from people who are forced into that and don't see the double meaning of a habit, right? Yes, something that you're doing repeatedly that is automatic, you're not thinking about. And if you look at it from the outside, you're like, okay, this is just pointless. This is meaningless. This is devoid of what it's supposed to be. But what I've found, and as I talked about my friend who's Catholic, he said, that's how I originally thought about it, right, when I was a kid. But what I find now is that it's a comforting routine that gets you into a space. It gets you into, you're right, it is absolutely freeing your mind, but it's freeing your mind to think about what matters. So your body's doing the liturgy, right? Or your words, you're speaking the words. But what you do during that moment is up to you. You can use that time to say, why am I in church? Why are they forcing me to do this? Or you can use that time to say, am I helping others like I should? Am I deepening? Am I seeking God in the way that I feel I need to? And so you can use that space. It becomes a protected space for a spiritual moment. I think that's probably the best. I've never really talked about it like this, so I'm trying to come up with words for it. But I think that's what it's become for me. I really value, so I'm Quaker, right? I had no liturgy, no practice whatsoever growing up. But now I'm in this Lutheran meeting, and I find, I've built a habit. I'm part of the choir. I sing with it, right? And it is wonderful because it's a habit, because I now have this protected space for spiritual thought. Does that make sense? It's like this strange duality of habits.
Yeah, and I almost think it's almost like a form of like priming in a way, and then it's a habit that triggers you into a certain like state of mind in some kind of way. Like the action of doing it might not be conscious, but it does still prompt you into a mindset in a kind of way.
Right.
I think a lot of people do. A lot of like people read motivational quotes in the morning and stuff like that. Or like they might like it's there's the stuff about like, I know like science is a little dicing some of it, but people that like to do a power pose before they give a talk or something, like
Yeah.
those are all little habits that get you into feeling some kind of way. And it's that kind of thing where even if it becomes an unconscious action in of itself, that action still prompts your mind to think in a certain direction.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing.
So one thing that I wrote down, I think is would be interesting to jump to, and we sort of touched on this in a recent podcast with Near, in that there are certain things in life that I think we feel like we shouldn't have to behavioral design for, if you will.
Yeah.
So when we were talking with Near, it was about being intentional with your time and about things like spending more time with your kids, with your family, calling your parents once in a while. Stuff that we don't do as much as we should, but we also don't really take the time to think about how to change it, because there's sort of this guilt in thinking that this should be something that is automatic for me. Like it should not be hard to do it. And in a way, it prevents us from actually dealing with the problem and making it happen more, when in reality, they're not different than any other behavior that we do or don't do. Stuff gets in the way from doing the things we want to do. So I thought like we could expand on that a little bit in this. I think any sort of spiritual practice is very similar in that there is a guilt associated with not doing it. And almost that guilt leads you to feel like, man, I feel bad needing to work so hard at doing this or designing things in a way to make it happen. So maybe we can like expand on that a little bit, and that, like why this isn't necessarily that much different than anything else, but it feels different sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Eric. That, as behavioral scientists, we study in part how one's sense of identity affects their behavior, and how that sense of identity can be triggered, right? Selectively triggered. But we don't think, right? Things like our spiritual behavior, like spending time with our family, we treat in a different category. We think what I'm doing is an expression of my identity. Therefore, I must just be an awful person, and I've got to beat myself up over this. Or like, hey, if I'm not spending time with my kids, well, that means something, right? Whereas behavioralist, if you look at anybody else, right? If you're talking about this as a product design, if you're talking about it as a communications design, you're like, let's just ask this person if they want to spend time with their family. And if they do, let's go help them do it. We don't do that ourselves. It's a strange way we treat other people. And in some ways, we forgive other people more than we forgive ourselves. Yeah, I think about it as, we take it as a sign of our own failing, where for behavioral science, as you know, there are like two big camps in how we think about biases and heuristics versus fast and frugal shortcuts, right? And the dominant discussion in the US behavioral community is the biases and heuristics, that people are, that there are problems in how we act, right? And I've found that, this combination of behavioral science and spirituality I've come to is a lot closer to the fast and frugal. That no, it's not that we are perfect people with some problems. It's rather we are fundamentally limited beings, not bad, not good, just fundamentally limited. We have limited attention, we have limited willpower, we have limited memory, and cool. Take that as given. Accept our imperfection. What do we do to make things just a little bit better? And I find that's an easier place for us to forgive others, to be compassionate about their lack of action, about their what seems like insincerity and ability to follow through, and perhaps even more importantly, to be a little bit more forgiving of ourselves.
Yeah, and that brings me to another sort of like thing that you mentioned in the book that it is one of those things that in hindsight seemed very obvious, but I thought was really interesting that I hadn't thought of before. You had this like passage, section in the book is saying how, okay, let's say like religions are very old, and the almost the diagnosis of humanity of a lot of religions is kind of the exact same diagnosis that behavioral scientists have given, and that we are very limited. We have these natural failings, that there are things, processes, beliefs, whatever that is, that can help us like improve from that. So we can touch on that a little bit, because I thought that was like interesting, and that it's sort of interesting that, okay, thousands of years later, we've scientifically studied people and come to relatively the same conclusion that we did in, the BC era or whatever.
Which in hindsight is so darned obvious. I'm like, So, Erik, do you have a perfect memory of all things that ever happened? And can you calculate all mathematical values? I mean, any complex calculation in your head in an instant?
Probably
No,
not. No.
right? Like, that's the basis for a thoughtful behavioral position, right? That, okay, we're just limited and we do things, we take shortcuts that help us deal with these limitations. And I think about it as, in some way, the standard econ model, I'm going to go a little spiritual here, is basically saying, okay, we assume that people are God and that, they should act with omniscience. What is that as a starting point, right?
Yeah.
I certainly don't know anybody like that. And so behavioral science has come around to like, oh, wait a minute. No, that doesn't seem to be right. We're not
Something's
perfect
a little off
people.
there. Yeah.
There's something off there. And we came to something that is, well, yeah, thousands of years old. And that's just, people are imperfect. We can do better. Now, I personally believe in grace. So when I think about it, I'm like, look, it's not that we can optimize. It's not that like we can make ourselves the perfect people, but rather, look, we're imperfect. Everything we ever do is going to be imperfect. And maybe it's our part to try to be a little bit better. And in the end, if we are, some of it's luck and maybe some of it's God's helping us.
So, it's interesting. We've been talking about kind of like the limits of ourselves as people, and then you also have a section in the book on kind of like the limits of design too. And it's
Yeah.
something that like
Yeah.
we talk about a lot in other contexts, right? Where like sometimes, people, especially like say somebody who has just kind of learned about behavioral science and still sort of thinks that it's kind of like just magic, is like,
Yeah.
oh, like come in and like change, like use some behavioral science to change this thing. And you're like, well, actually, like you have like a bigger problem here, or you have like something like
Yeah.
here's I can move the needle like 2%, but you could make this other change that would just that would probably solve your problem much better. And so I was thinking about that in terms of like kind of the limits of spiritual design. And one of the things that seems to kind of, I was thinking about it over the course of this conversation, is like it seems that like you really can't get over autonomy. Like people, it seems like you want people to be making these choices for themselves, right? And a lot of like the sort of getting rid of this baggage, right, is in some cases, or at least the examples that we've talked about, is potentially this could be overcoming, a lack of autonomy that somebody had early on, in the sense that like they felt anyways that sort of, a religion or a tradition or something was kind of forced on them as opposed to them choosing it. And that even in, like the example that you talked about of like, kind of before you had faith, you were still pausing and kind of having this moment of reflection before a meal. You were still getting some kind of positive feeling out of that, right? Like whether that was just a moment to reflect or a connection to this, like older tradition or whatever. So there are some like limits to this design, and you kind of talk about them a little bit in the book, but I'm wondering if you can sort of expand on that a little bit now too.
Yeah, so I think about it in kind of three ways. First, and I should have said in this beginning, there ain't any research out there about behavioral science and religion. So everything I'm talking about is a translation. It's an attempt to think like, what could this mean? So that's one big honking limitation. There are no experimental studies, to the best of my knowledge, from a behavioral perspective on people's experience of religion. So that's number one, right? So, I'm really clear on that in the beginning of the book, but I didn't mention it here. Second is that just like everything in behavioral science, there are no magic wands. For me, the self-signaling, I find it really powerful. For me, situational self-control, right? When I trying to avoid temptations that I know are harmful for me, I find that really powerful, right? Trying to avoid the queue, et cetera, things that Angela Duckworth talks about in her work. But people are different. And so what works for me isn't going to work for another person necessarily. We have to try it out ourselves, right? That's the second area is there are no universals here. And the third area is it's more than just there are no universals. There's backfires. There's things that will actually hurt people. And we have to be really, really careful. We have to be careful in ourselves, and we absolutely have to be careful when we try and tell other people what to do. Because just as we see in the context of saving for the future or in electrical use, et cetera, that people who are far from that standard can get discouraged. Right, a backfire effect that for many people it helps them, and for others it actually puts them in the opposite direction. we should expect the same, right? And we should be really, really careful, especially with our kids, right? That, like, for me, I want to give them a tradition they can learn from, but not to try and force them to act in a way that they look at a habit and say, that's meaningless. I want to give them that protected space to explore and to find God, but not to feel like they have to do something, right? So those are the three areas. There are lots of limitations, but I kind of put them in those three buckets.
Yeah, I mean, so that is an interesting topic. I mean, like, especially in light of kind of the comment I made a moment ago of, like, you know, that sense of, like, autonomy, right? Like, I think that in general, when I mean, I'm not a parent, but from what I have observed and kind of, you know, how I think about this, you know, it's always a balance of, like, giving them autonomy, but providing them guidance and sort of helping them grow. I mean, I would think that that's kind of true in probably all areas of their life, but certainly in kind of like spiritual practice as well. Like, how do you kind of balance that stuff?
I mean, first, I try to set my own imperfect example. I try in my own life to spend time turning towards God, right? Focus. And I spend time trying to act out the faith, right? To live, to help others in need, to be compassionate, etc. And I think I think that matters for my kids. And then we give them the opportunity to learn. We don't force them, right? But we give them the opportunity to learn, right? We have Sunday school. We have the Bible there if they want to read it, kids, etc. Right? And we have other traditions as well. But we try to make it an assumed part of life that it's normal to think about, without setting what they should be thinking, right? So the real challenge that I've seen for so many folks, and myself included, was not thinking that spirituality was normal.
Mm-hmm.
It's this horrible irony that we all think that what we're doing isn't normal when we're all doing it. And not everybody, of course, right? But at different times in our lives, most people seem to have times of the hunger, the times of the desire to reach out. And so for my kids, and to the extent that I talk about this with others, which admittedly I often don't, I don't try to push anything. I just try to help make it normal to think about it and normal to experience it. I think that's the most powerful thing I'm trying to do for my kids. And one of them is really, really deep into it, right? And the other isn't. And okay. Either way, both of them see this as something that is a normal and okay part of one's life, which I fear for many Americans, it doesn't feel that way anymore.
One of the other things that this is kind of reminding me of, and this is kind of more along your second point of limitation of essentially experimentation, right? Like, you need to try different things. Some things are going to work better for other folks than for me or for you. Is we just had a conversation with David No about behavioral design, and he was talking about the you might have heard this already, but like the swarm of bees approach, right? Where it's like you know, he has, this is from BJ Fogg's new book, where, you know, you try out a bunch of different things and you kind of see what seems to sort of stick and what seems to kind of motivate you. We talked about even kind of how to do that when it's something that you're not necessarily immediately getting some kind of feedback or satisfaction from, where I could think that maybe in some cases spiritual practice might be like that. But it sounds like that's to some extent kind of the approach that, I don't know if you would say that you've taken or are advocating, but like trying different things and sort of seeing what seems to resonate with you is like one path of kind of doing that experimentation or exploration.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's it's the spaghetti on the wall. I think of behavioral science as a set of tools that can help people change behavior, change their focus as well. But we don't know necessarily what they're very context dependent, and so we should try in different contexts and see what works for us. And I want to be also careful and say not works for us in the sense of what makes us feel good, because doing drugs makes you feel good, right? That's not the point. It's rather in my own experience, there's something that makes us feel good, and there's something that makes us feel whole. There's something that makes us feel right. And I look myself for that discernment to separate out the two. to understand, okay, yeah, I feel peace from this. I feel a connection with the world around me, with, in my tradition, in God's creation. And so it's more than just trial and error. It's also what we call discernment, right? Which is listening and seeing, does this resonate? Is the word you used is probably the best one. Does it resonate? And not just, it's really easy to find things that you like. It's a somewhat different and a more subtle task to find things that are right for you.
Yeah, and I think that's common in a lot of parts of life. You think about work, for example. It's easy. You can find a job that might pay you well, and but it's not really like rewarding or fulfilling.
Yeah, right.
In like
Exactly.
a more like simple example, and it's like you got to kind of play around with different type of roles and skills and things until you find that match. So yeah, it's an experimental sort of mindset to it. So we're getting kind of close to the end of our time here, but one question I thought it would be interesting to sort of loop things back between both and maybe flip it on its side a little bit is we talked a lot about taking behavioral science approach and behavioral design for like spiritual practice, but how does it does it work ever in like kind of the flip side? And how does, maybe in your own experience or maybe as you've seen in others or how it could work, how can spiritual practice sort of influence behavioral design in a way? Especially, in your work, you're somebody who does it for a living. So how does that kind of flip side relationship work, and how can behavioral design be motivated by these kind of practices?
Yeah, I mean, this would be kind of very specific to me. I'm not sure it'll be useful for anybody else, but I think for me, it's helped me move from the biases and heuristics, from the shortcomings of people approach to having, I hope, I really hope, just having a bit more compassion and saying that, wow, I'm a broken person, so is everyone else, and okay, let's see how we can help. That it also helps me kind of connect with what behavioral science is trying to do. It's not just about, wow, these are cool, we can change people's behavior, but rather, what does it really mean to help? And for me, it means, what does it really mean to live out my faith? We all have jobs to do. We all have work, right? Spirituality doesn't have to be this thing you do on the side. It shouldn't, for me, I find it can inform how we do our work, how we approach our relationships to others. Are we treating people as, in my tradition, as fellow creatures of God? Are we treating others as imperfect, wonderful beings that we want to help do slightly better, right? And so I did start with behavioral science a lot of as here's some techniques, here's an approach. I thought it was very methodological, right? Analytical. Now I'm trying to live my faith in my work a bit more, right? And do right by people because it's right and not just because it's a cool technique.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, for one, we can really get a lot of us that are into this really nerd out on the specifics and the process and like stuff like that. But it is important to step back and remind like how powerful this stuff can be, and just like helping people lead better lives in a lot of different ways. Like in your example of a lot of your career folks, how do you help people save more money? Like money is a enormous stressor in people's lives, and if you can help just a little bit there, you can have a really big impact. And then you can think deeper about things like meaning, and there's just so much we can do as a field, and it's important to kind of keep that in mind and go beyond just this particular experiment we're running, and that we're doing this because we can really help people connect to living the lives that they want to live, and that's kind of the benefit of it. And then there's the other side of it too. I think it's such an important part of being in this field to do it well is that you really need to have a lot of empathy. And I think the more I've learned it, I've become a lot more empathetic, and that I don't really judge people for not doing stuff that, maybe is easy to me. Or, people that don't believe the same things as me in any kind of realm. I don't really find that frustrating, because I get it. Like I kind of see how people come to different ways of thinking of things. And even if, to me it's wrong, I also kind of see where they're coming from and why they're kind of thinking that kind of way. So I think this broadly for behavioral science, those are two really important things to remember, and that, there's this broader impact we can have in helping people live better lives. And also that we got to remember that empathy aspect of it, and that people of different spiritual beliefs, different political beliefs, different whatever, if we know this stuff, we should understand that there's a lot of ways people end up at those, and it's not a judgment thing. It's just a different design or whatever led us there.
Exactly. I mean, we have a tremendous tool to do some good in the world. And yeah, I mean, that's empathy. That's, it starts with empathy, and starts with taking the tools we have seriously. Because man, we can do a lot of good, or we can really screw people up, right? I mean, there's sadly some of both.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, that too.
Well, I think that is a pretty great place to end on. I mean, yeah, thinking about how we can be more empathetic and help people make better choices or meet the goals that they have for themselves. Steve, thanks so much for talking us through the book. It's a really interesting topic, and as you pointed out, there isn't really any kind of research on this. It's sort of a brand new thing, and it was very interesting for me to read, and enjoyed the conversation as well. So thanks for spending time with us.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, let me also just, to cap it off, if people are interested in learning more about the book, and even just more broadly about your work, where should they find resources, information, additional stuff?
Sure. So I'm not out to make any money off of this, and if I were, I'd be horribly disappointed. So I'm happy to give the book to anyone on this podcast, right? Anybody who's listening. So if you go to spiritualdesign.co/book, you can download the copy for free, and I'm happy for you to take a look. Give me some feedback. Tell me where it's crazy. Tell me where it might be useful.
I will say, as someone who's worked with you extensively, when Steve says he wants feedback, he wants feedback. So do not feel like that's an empty offer. He will take whatever you throw at him.
So please, just feel free to take the book, give it to others. If you want, it is on Amazon and you can buy it, but you don't have to. Feel free to take a copy at spiritualdesign.co/book and take it from there. So there are lots of citations in there about the little bit of research that I've found. It's all tangential. There's a book called Irrational Jesus that talks about some of these issues, and that's the only other book I've found, and that's it's a great book, but it's the only other thing out there. But if you want to learn more about the techniques, about self-signaling, about social norms as they apply to spiritual practice and living out one's faith, just anytime, also reach out to me. There's a contact form there as well on spiritualdesign.co.
Great. Well, I think it's a great place to end it. So, Steve, thanks so much for joining us. This is a super interesting conversation. It was really interesting preparing for it and reading through the book, and just thinking of a whole different perspective on our field that we haven't really talked about before. So, hopefully, people enjoy a unique angle and a very kind of niche look at behavioral science that we haven't covered before.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Erik Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and many other platforms where you might typically get your pod on. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendel, founder of the Action Design Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness about behavioral economics, psychology, and all things behavioral science in order to help you improve your life, your career, and your understanding of the world around us and the people in it. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once again, that's action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States and Canada. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.